Let's break down this mix from the band Jungle. Their mixes just feel so nice and pleasing. They kind of wrap around you like a warm, saturated analog hug. So let's dive into how they do that. So this is Jungle's most popular track, Back on 74, but everything I'm about to talk about kind of applies to all their songs in general. So let's start with the drums first, and we'll get into the bass, and then the instruments, and then we'll talk about the vocals and dive into those last. The whole song starts with just these drums playing by themselves, and they pretty much don't stop the entire song besides the bridge. It's just this nice 8th note syncopated groove that everything else is built on top of. And there's a couple things that are interesting about these drums compared to most other modern mixes these days. If I were to just totally remove the snare hit, this is what you would see. So the thing that sticks out to me is the hi-hats and percussion. Most modern mixes would have their hi-hats sitting somewhere up here, a lot louder in the mix. But to get that old school feel, they put the hi-hats and percussions and the high end of those things really low in the mix, like somewhere around like 20 decibels lower than most modern mixes would put their hi-hats. It gives it that like rolled off high-end old school feel. Then when the snare comes in, it's providing this like high-end snap that is like a rhythmic anchor for everything else. And you can see how much louder that snare is mixed than all the other drums, because they just want that snare to be the anchor and everything else around it to provide the groove. Now let's bring in the bass. And it's pretty obvious that the bass is mixed in a way that's meant to be felt and not heard. If they wanted the bass to come through better on phone speakers or be heard more, then they would do something like this. They might distort it a little more. Then I would add an EQ just to focus it on frequencies you can hear more on like laptop and phone speakers. So before those two effects, it looks like this. And then after, the bass frequencies are just a lot more present in this low mid range, so they come through better on systems. But if you actually did this in the full mix, it totally kills the laid back vibe of the mix. It sounds too distorted. You really want that bass to just be felt, and you don't want it to be too present. Also, if we look at the kick again, its fundamental frequency is around like 50 something hertz, whereas the bass lives in like the 80 to 120 hertz area. And really what this allows them to do is not add that much sidechain compression to the bass to get it out of the way of the kick drum, because you don't want like a pumping effect on the bass in the song. You want it to sound smooth and natural. And we can tell the bass is compressed really well because it's a nice even signal. So it's always present. You're never going to lose the power of the bass, but they didn't add a ton of other effects on it to make it overly distorted or take your attention away from other parts of the track. And then for most of the verses until the second half of the song, there's really just one guitar playing. And you can see they haven't even compressed this guitar that much. You can see the volume difference between the loudest parts of the guitar and the quietest parts. There's a big dynamic range. And also, if we look at the vector scope, the guitar is really narrow in the mix too. It's not taking up that much width. So it's really, they took this guitar and they left it pretty dry on purpose. You can also hear there's almost no reverb on it. So we can see the guitar has not a lot of compression, not a lot of stereo width, pretty much no reverb, and that's all to give the vocals, which are the star of the show, room to shine.
Keep me rocking on the same line when we get high on your breakdown.
Now if I hold the peaks for a second, you can see if I just play the instrumental, that U shape there is leaving all that room for the vocals to come through in the mid-range.
Keep me rocking on the same line when we get high on your breakdown.
So let's get into how they get this old school feel with the vocals. Let's use a different vocal that I can process from scratch as an example.
Falling to pieces.
Don't let me go.
So the first thing we would want is to compress the vocal, but not too much. We want to keep the dynamic range and just have a little bit of compression. So I can use a soft knee for that. I can use a vintage compression mode, a little bit of a longer attack and release. We don't need any hold. I can dial back the ratio and just feel out a few decibels of compression on these vocals.
Falling to pieces. Don't let me go. The paint is flaking on.
And for this style, a big reason why you don't want to overly compress the vocals is because of the saturation that comes next. So I'm going to add some warm tube saturation on these vocals.
Falling to pieces. Don't let me go.
So Jungle's vocals have a lot of nice saturation on them, and if your vocal volume is too even and overly compressed, then every word will be hitting that saturation at the same level. But you actually want some words to be pushing into the saturation harder than others, and it gives it this really cool, natural feeling where some words are pushing into the saturation more than others. Then while they're recording the vocals, I bet on purpose they push the input signal of the vocals too hard into the preamp to get some natural saturation and distortion while they're recording the vocal to make it sound more old school too. Like they're pushing the level too hard into the preamp. And then it's all about having like a big, lush reverb that kind of swallows the vocals, like more reverb than you would generally add. So that's why instead of a send track, I would add this right on the vocals channel strip.
Falling to pieces. Don't let me go.
I'll turn this up so you can hear it better, but I find when I turn down the size on a reverb, it makes it sound a lot dirtier. Like listen to it with the size up.
Falling to pieces. Falling to pieces.
It makes this like dissonant effect that sounds a little eerie, so I definitely want a little bit of that. I don't want the size all the way up. And then I want some pre-delay on here.
Falling to pieces.
And I want to have a pretty long decay time.
Falling to pieces.
So before that vocal chain, it sounded like this.
Falling to pieces.
And then after,
Falling to pieces.
I'm not saying that's the vocal chain that Jungle uses at all,
We're just watching from the same town.
but you can really tell if you analyze their vocals, they don't use a ton of processing on the vocals. They definitely use a little bit of compression, but they want to keep it dynamic. The main thing is adding a lot of saturation and reverb to the vocals. And I bet that they don't mess with the EQ of the vocals that much because they want it to sound natural. And we can tell if we look at the peak frequencies.
We're just watching.
So we can see where the S sounds are peaking. They're actually peaking really loud. The sibilance is coming through and it's loud. Like that's minus 30 decibels right there. But then other parts of the vocal,
Keep me walking.
like if we look at this part, look where the high end is. It's way down here, like minus 48 decibels. So that's like almost a 20 decibel difference between the sibilance and the rest of the vocal. And that tells me they're not de-essing these vocals very much. They're not compressing these vocals very much. They're not EQing these vocals very much. They're just letting it sound natural. They're letting the sibilance come through. But for the most part, the high end is kind of rolled off. It helps give it that old school feel because most modern pop vocals would be compressed up here and the high end would just be sitting a lot higher the whole time and be a lot more even, but that just wouldn't work at all for this style, which is kind of like 70s soul music. Now let's go to the chorus. So notice how wide the vocals are, because there's a lot of vocal layers going on, they're panned in certain directions, and the reverb is nice and big. But now just look at the instrumental. There's not much stereo widening at all. The instrumental is like right in the middle of the mix, which is another thing that adds to that old school vibe. Because old school mixes, the instrumental was not wide at all. It was like almost mono, and the vocal layers panned to different sides are what add the width. So this is how you get that feeling of the vocals kind of like wrapping around you like a warm hug because of that contrast between the instrumental, which is in the middle, and the vocals, which are really wide with that lush reverb, and it just feels like it's wrapping around you when you're listening to it. If the instrumental was just as wide as the vocals, you really wouldn't get that effect. It's all about the contrast between the two. And I think contrast is really the key to a great mix. It doesn't have to be just contrast in width. It can be contrast in anything. Like if we listen to the bass, drums, and guitar, they are really dry, like with almost no reverb. Then the vocals are the exact opposite of that. They have a big, lush reverb on them.
Keep me walking on the same line.
I think the song also shows you if the songwriting is really good, you don't need to keep adding a ton of layers to fill out the mix. Just focus on the important things that are already there. Like most of the song is just drums with that subtle bass part, and then literally just one guitar. So not overcrowding the mix just leaves everything feeling really open and giving everything space to breathe, which is a big part of why this mix sounds so nice. It's really not until the end of the song when they actually start adding more layers to up the energy a little bit. But even then, they're not pushing any of these elements too loud in the mix. You're still getting that U shape to let the vocals come through. And they do a really nice job of subtly progressing the energy of each element throughout the track. Like in the beginning of the track, there's no background synths or extra layers, it's just the guitar, but then by the end of the track, you have this. And the drums at the beginning sound like this. And then by the end, all they're doing is adding a little extra percussion, like a tambourine loop, just to give it a little more energy. Even the bass guitar starts out looking very filtered, but then by the end, they're letting it come out a little more in the low mid range. So even the bass is subtly progressing in how much energy it's adding to the mix. Then of course by the end, the vocals are at their fullest with some ad-libs going on in the background and lots of harmony layers. But even if you look at those male background vocals, boom, 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 boom. So look how rolled off the high end is in those background vocals, but the low end is also rolled off in those background vocals. Like normally male vocals have a bunch of energy around this like 100 to 300 hertz range, and that's just not there with these male background vocals, and that's what gives it that old school feel, just concentrating it in the mid-range. Anyway, I'll play the full track together one more time again at the end, and if you want me to do more mix breakdowns like this, just let me know. By the way, this plugin I've been using throughout the video is my plugin called Blueprint. There's a 14-day free trial of it if you want to check it out at bigzstudios.com, or you can hit the link below. Other than that, I'll catch you guys next time. Peace.